The morning sun painted golden streaks across the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant William Hayes adjusted his scarlet tunic for what he believed would be just another ordinary day of royal duty. At 52 years old, William had dedicated nearly 3 decades of his life to serving the British royal family with unwavering loyalty and pride. His weathered hands bore the calluses of countless hours gripping ceremonial weapons, and his eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had witnessed history unfold before him. William came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and now he carried on the family tradition of honor and service. The red uniform he wore with such dignity represented more than just a job to him. It symbolized generations of dedication, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond with the monarchy that had shaped his entire identity. As he walked through the corridors that morning, William's mind drifted to his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away just 6 months earlier after a brave battle with cancer. She had always been so proud of his service, often telling their children how their father protected the most important people in the country. The memories of her encouraging smile during difficult times still gave him strength, even though the grief felt like a constant weight on his chest. The castle was buzzing with unusual activity that day. Queen Camilla was scheduled to attend a private ceremony honoring veterans of recent conflicts. As the newly crowned queen consort, she was still establishing her own traditions and protocols, sometimes creating tension with the established ways of doing things that had been followed for decades. William had mixed feelings about the changes happening within the royal household since King Charles had taken the throne. While he respected the monarchy completely, some of the new protocols seemed to clash with the time-honored traditions he had sworn to uphold. His fellow guards often discussed these changes during their brief breaks, expressing quiet concerns about maintaining the dignity and respect that had always defined their service. Standing at his assigned post near the Queen's private chambers, William noticed an unusual number of palace officials hurrying back and forth. Lady Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary, approached him with a serious expression that immediately caught his attention. She was known for her efficiency and direct manner of speaking, rarely wasting words on unnecessary conversation. "Sergeant Hayes," she said in her crisp, authoritative voice, "Her Majesty has requested a special protocol for today's ceremony. When she enters the room, all guards are to kneel and remain in that position until she gives permission to stand. This is a new tradition she wishes to implement to demonstrate proper respect for her position." William felt a cold sensation in his stomach as he processed these words. In all his years of service, guards had never been required to kneel before any member of the royal family during regular duties. They stood at attention, saluted when appropriate, and showed respect through their disciplined posture and unwavering dedication. Kneeling was reserved for very specific ceremonial occasions and was never demanded as a regular requirement. The request troubled him deeply, not because he lacked respect for Queen Camilla, but because it went against everything he had been taught about royal protocol during his extensive training. His military instructors had emphasized that a guard's dignity and readiness were essential to their effectiveness. Kneeling would compromise their ability to respond quickly to any potential threats and seemed to contradict the very essence of their protective role. William's mind raced as he considered his options. He had never directly disobeyed an order from a member of the royal family, and the thought of doing so made him feel physically ill. Yet something deep inside him rebelled against this new requirement. It felt wrong, as if it somehow diminished both his role as a protector and the respected traditions that had guided royal guards for generations. As the morning progressed, William watched his fellow guards receiving the same instructions. Some nodded obediently and seemed to accept the new protocol without question. Others exchanged worried glances, clearly sharing his discomfort with the unusual request. The atmosphere among the guards grew tense as word spread throughout their ranks about what would be expected of them. During a brief moment when he could step away from his post, William sought out his longtime friend and colleague, Sergeant Michael Thompson. Michael had served almost as long as William and came from a similar background of military family tradition. The two men had supported each other through countless challenges over the years, and William trusted Michael's judgment completely. "What do you think about this kneeling business, Michael?" William asked quietly as they stood in a secluded alcove away from the main corridors. His voice carried the weight of genuine concern and confusion. Michael shook his head slowly, his expression troubled. "I don't like it, William. It doesn't feel right. We're supposed to be guardians, not servants cowering before royalty. There's a difference between showing respect and being humiliated." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Both men quickly returned to their positions, but William's mind continued to churn with conflicting thoughts and emotions. The ceremony was only a few hours away, and he needed to make a decision that could potentially end his career and destroy everything he had worked for throughout his adult life. As he stood at attention, William thought about the oath he had taken when he first joined the Royal Guard. He had promised to serve with honor, dignity, and unwavering loyalty. But what happened when those principles seemed to conflict with a direct order? Which was more important, blind obedience or maintaining the integrity of the traditions he had sworn to protect? The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a heavy burden. He thought about his children, who were so proud of their father's service. He thought about his late wife, who had always encouraged him to stand up for what he believed was right, even when it was difficult. He thought about his grandfather's stories of courage during wartime and his father's tales of honor during peacetime service. William realized that this moment would define not just his career, but his character. Whatever choice he made would stay with him for the rest of his life, and he wanted to be able to look at himself in the mirror with pride and dignity. The ceremony was approaching rapidly, and soon he would have to face Queen Camilla and make a decision that would change everything. The Great Hall of Windsor Castle had been transformed into an elegant venue for the veterans' ceremony. Polished marble floors reflected the light from magnificent chandeliers, while portraits of past monarchs gazed down from gilded frames, as if bearing witness to the unfolding events. William stood with 5 other guards positioned strategically around the room, their scarlet uniforms a striking contrast against the cream-colored walls and rich mahogany furnishings. As the appointed hour approached, William's heart hammered against his ribcage with such force that he worried others might hear it. His palms felt clammy inside his white gloves, and despite years of training to remain calm under pressure, he struggled to maintain his usual composure. The internal battle between duty and conscience had been raging in his mind for hours, leaving him exhausted before the ceremony had even begun. The double doors at the far end of the hall opened with ceremonial precision, and palace officials began filing in to take their positions. William recognized many faces among the assembled dignitaries, including several veterans who would be honored that day. These were men and women who had sacrificed greatly for their country, and their presence reminded him of the weight and significance of true service. Lady Pemberton appeared near the entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the room to ensure everything was in perfect order. When her gaze met William's, she gave him a pointed look that clearly reminded him of the expected protocol. He felt a knot form in his stomach as he realized there would be no escape from the decision he had been dreading all morning. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the hall, growing steadily louder as Queen Camilla made her way toward the ceremony. William could hear the rustle of fabric and the soft conversation of her accompanying entourage. In just moments, he would be faced with the choice that could define the rest of his life and career. When Queen Camilla entered the room, she moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. She wore an elegant navy blue dress with pearl accessories, and her presence immediately commanded respect from everyone in the hall. As she crossed the threshold, William watched his fellow guards beginning to lower themselves to their knees as they had been instructed. The sight of his colleagues kneeling created a surreal scene that felt completely foreign to everything William had experienced during his decades of service. These were proud, disciplined men who had dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, and seeing them in such a position felt fundamentally wrong to him. The image contradicted every lesson he had learned about the dignified relationship between the monarchy and those sworn to serve them. Queen Camilla's eyes swept across the kneeling guards with apparent satisfaction before settling on William, who remained standing at rigid attention. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as everyone realized that one guard had failed to follow the new protocol. The tension became so thick that William could almost feel it pressing against his skin like a physical force. For what felt like an eternity, Queen Camilla and William stared at each other across the ornate hall. Her expression shifted from surprise to irritation as she realized he was deliberately defying her command. William maintained his professional posture, but inside he felt as though his entire world was crumbling around him. This was not how he had imagined his career would end. "Sergeant Hayes," Queen Camilla's voice cut through the silence like a blade, carrying clear authority and growing displeasure. "You seem to have forgotten the protocol that was explained to you this morning. I expect you to kneel immediately." William felt every eye in the room focusing on him as he struggled to find his voice. His throat felt dry as sandpaper, and his carefully rehearsed words seemed to abandon him when he needed them most. Taking a deep breath, he summoned every ounce of courage he possessed and spoke in a voice that remained steady despite his inner turmoil. "Your Majesty," he began, his words carrying the weight of 3 decades of loyal service. "With the greatest respect for your position and person, I cannot comply with this request. In my years of service to the Crown, I have been taught that a guard's duty is to protect and serve while maintaining the dignity that makes us effective in that role. Kneeling compromises both our readiness and the traditions that have guided royal protection for generations." The silence that followed William's statement was deafening. Several palace officials exchanged shocked glances, clearly horrified by this unprecedented act of defiance. Lady Pemberton's face had gone pale, and she looked as though she might faint from the stress of witnessing such a breach of protocol. Even the veterans being honored seemed stunned by the unfolding drama. Queen Camilla's face flushed with anger as she processed William's refusal. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not in front of an audience of important guests and officials. The public nature of his defiance made it even more intolerable, as it threatened to undermine her authority and the respect she was still working to establish in her new role. "Sergeant Hayes," she said, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge, "you are being insubordinate and disrespectful. I am giving you one final opportunity to follow my direct command. Kneel now, or face the consequences of your actions." William felt his heart breaking as he realized there would be no going back from this moment. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built his life around, was about to be destroyed by his refusal to abandon his principles. Yet even as he faced the end of his career, he felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. He was finally being true to the values his family had instilled in him and the oath he had sworn to serve with honor. "Your Majesty," William replied, his voice now stronger and more confident, "I have given 30 years of my life in faithful service to this institution. I have protected your family, upheld the dignity of the crown, and honored the traditions that make the monarchy respected around the world. I cannot and will not compromise those principles, even at the cost of my position." The confrontation had reached a point where neither participant could back down without losing face. Queen Camilla clearly felt that her authority was being challenged in an unacceptable way, while William had committed himself to a path that would inevitably lead to his dismissal. The other guards remained kneeling, trapped in an awkward position as witnesses to this historic clash between tradition and change. As the tension reached its peak, William noticed something unexpected in the faces of the veterans attending the ceremony. Instead of disapproval or shock, many of them were looking at him with what appeared to be understanding and even admiration. These were people who had faced their own moments of moral courage during their military service, and they seemed to recognize the difficulty of his position. The ceremony had been completely derailed by the confrontation, and it was clear that something would have to be resolved before the event could continue. Queen Camilla appeared to be calculating her next move, while William stood ready to face whatever consequences awaited him. The moment had become about much more than royal protocol. It had become a test of character, principle, and the true meaning of honor in service to the crown. The standoff in the Great Hall stretched on for what felt like hours, though in reality only minutes had passed since William's final refusal to kneel. Queen Camilla's face had darkened with a mixture of anger and embarrassment as she realized that her authority was being openly challenged in front of distinguished guests. The kneeling guards remained frozen in their uncomfortable positions, unsure whether to stand or maintain their pose while the confrontation continued. William noticed beads of perspiration forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the castle. His entire future hung in the balance, and he could almost hear the sound of his career crashing down around him. Yet somewhere deep inside, he felt a growing sense of pride that surprised him. For the first time in months since Margaret's death, he felt truly connected to something meaningful and important. The silence was finally broken by an unexpected voice from among the assembled veterans. Colonel James Morrison, a decorated war hero in his 70s, slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the center of the room. His movements were deliberate and dignified, and his presence immediately commanded attention from everyone present, including Queen Camilla. "Your Majesty," Colonel Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men in battle and understood the true nature of honor and duty. "If I may be permitted to speak, I believe we are witnessing something quite remarkable here today." Queen Camilla looked startled by the interruption, but nodded for him to continue, perhaps hoping he would support her position and help resolve the uncomfortable situation. The colonel's words, however, took the conversation in a direction no one had anticipated. "I have spent my entire adult life in service to this great nation and the crown," Colonel Morrison continued, his gaze moving between Queen Camilla and William. "I have seen men face impossible choices between competing duties and loyalties. What Sergeant Hayes has demonstrated today is not disrespect or insubordination, but rather the highest form of loyalty to the very institution he has sworn to protect." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests as they processed the colonel's unexpected defense of William's actions. Lady Pemberton looked as though she might have a heart attack from the stress of watching the ceremony spiral completely out of control. Several other veterans began nodding in agreement with the colonel's assessment. "The traditions of royal protocol exist for important reasons," Colonel Morrison explained, his voice growing stronger and more passionate. "They maintain the dignity and effectiveness of those who serve the crown. When we ask our protectors to compromise their ability to perform their duties, we weaken the very foundation of the security and respect they provide." William felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to the colonel's words. For the first time since the confrontation began, he felt that someone truly understood his position and the impossible choice he had been forced to make. The validation meant more to him than he could have imagined, especially coming from someone whose military record commanded such universal respect. Queen Camilla appeared to be reconsidering her position as she absorbed the colonel's perspective. The public support for William's stance from such a respected figure clearly had an impact on her thinking. She looked around the room and seemed to notice for the first time that many of the other veterans were nodding in agreement with Colonel Morrison's assessment. Another veteran, a younger woman named Captain Sarah Chen, who had served in Afghanistan, stood up to add her voice to the discussion. "Your Majesty, with respect, I believe the Colonel is right. The men and women who protect you need to maintain their dignity and readiness. Asking them to kneel regularly would send the wrong message about their role and capabilities." The momentum in the room was clearly shifting in William's favor, though he remained at attention and tried to keep his expression neutral. He had not expected this level of support from people he barely knew, and their courage in speaking up moved him deeply. The confrontation was evolving into something much larger than a simple dispute over protocol. Queen Camilla stood quietly for several long moments, apparently weighing her options carefully. The situation had become far more complex than she had anticipated, and the public nature of the disagreement meant that whatever decision she made would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Her reputation and authority were at stake, but so was her relationship with the military community and the broader public. "Sergeant Hayes," Queen Camilla finally said, her voice noticeably calmer than it had been during their earlier exchange. "Please step forward." William moved toward her with measured steps, maintaining his military bearing while preparing for whatever judgment awaited him. The room fell silent again as everyone waited to see how this unprecedented situation would be resolved. He stopped at an appropriate distance and waited for her to speak. "Your service record is exemplary," Queen Camilla said, her tone now more thoughtful than angry. 30 years of dedication and loyalty cannot be dismissed lightly. I can see that your refusal comes from principle rather than disrespect." William felt a flicker of hope, though he tried not to let it show on his face. The acknowledgement of his motivation felt like a small victory, even if his career was still hanging by a thread. "However," Queen Camilla continued, "we cannot have guards selectively following orders based on their personal interpretations of protocol. There must be discipline and consistency in how we operate." The hope William had felt began to fade as he realized she was building toward his dismissal. He had known this was likely from the moment he first refused to kneel, but hearing it articulated still felt like a physical blow. He thought about how he would explain this to his children and what he would do with the rest of his life. "Therefore," Queen Camilla said, pausing dramatically as the entire room held its breath, "I am withdrawing the kneeling requirement. The traditional protocols that have served us well for generations will remain in effect." A collective gasp went up from the assembled crowd as they processed this unexpected resolution. William felt his knees go weak with relief, though he managed to maintain his posture through sheer force of will. The other guards slowly rose from their kneeling positions, looking confused but grateful to return to their normal stance. "Sergeant Hayes," Queen Camilla addressed him directly, "your commitment to maintaining the dignity of your position while expressed in an unorthodox manner ultimately serves the best interests of the Crown. You may return to your duties." The ceremony continued with the original protocol restored, and William resumed his position with a profound sense of gratitude and relief. The veterans who had spoken up for him offered subtle nods of approval as the formal proceedings got back on track. The atmosphere in the room gradually returned to normal, though everyone present knew they had witnessed something historically significant. In the weeks that followed, word of the confrontation spread throughout the palace and beyond. William found himself something of a celebrity among his fellow guards, many of whom privately thanked him for standing up for their collective dignity. The story reached the media, where it was generally portrayed as an example of principled courage in the face of inappropriate demands. William never discussed the incident publicly, maintaining his professional discretion and respect for the royal family. However, the experience had changed him in profound ways. He felt reconnected to his sense of purpose and pride in his service, emotions that had been dulled by grief and routine in recent months. Most importantly, William realized that his late wife would have been proud of his decision. Margaret had always encouraged him to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult or costly. In that moment of crisis, her voice had guided him toward a choice that honored both his principles and his service to the crown. The confrontation became a turning point in William's career and personal life. He served with renewed dedication for several more years before retiring with full honors and the deep respect of his colleagues and superiors. The tradition he had fought to preserve continued to guide future generations of royal guards, ensuring that their dignity and effectiveness remained intact for years to come.